Hey, everybody, welcome back to Pandemic Radio. On this edition, we will be discussing an exciting new subfield in epidemiology called visual epidemiology. So, in contrast to the more well established kind of traditional subfields that we've been learning about, like infectious disease epidemiology, there's also well established subfields like chronic disease epidemiology. While these are cool and useful, there's also these um, new and emerging subfields, part of which are in response to uh, like the emerging technology and the way that people are studying and understanding human health. So I wanted to share with you guys this relatively new, this is only a few years old field called visual epidemiology, and give you guys a quick overview of what it is and some of the main principles of this subfield. So when a lot of people think epidemiology, they think of stuff like this. And while epidemiology is certainly a quantitative discipline, again, the epidemiology approach is to count disease and to describe disease so we can find patterns. And this is done through putting numbers to people and diseases and risk factors and things like that. And it produces tables like this that we've been dealing with all semester long, right? Um, this is incredibly important and useful. And actually, this is a part of visual epidemiology. But where visual epidemiology departs from traditional epidemiology is, I think, in the visualization, right? It's like the name implies. So this table is useful, but like putting a map to it is even more useful because again, the name of the game is to understand the underlying patterns that are driving the distribution of disease. So this table on the left is a study looking at overdose deaths and some of the factors associated with increased or decreased risk of overdose. On the right, we see maps of where these overdoses are occurring. So we can look at like changes over time. We can look at changes like in location. We can see that the risk is not evenly distributed across the landscape, and that at some parts of the country it's increasing over time. So again, hashtag patterns. Patterns is the name of the game. That is a huge part of epidemiology. And this is kind of what we've been used to thinking about and doing so far. Okay. But I'm going to talk about in a second why visual epidemiology takes this a step further and how it does that. So, again, numbers and statistics are critically important and a really fundamental part of what epidemiology is. It's the study of patterns of health and disease in human populations. But knowing something through numbers and facts and statistics is different than feeling something. Pretty profound. So the example I'm going to use is this: mining as a risk factor and its association with human health outcomes. This is a typical epidemiology table looking at mine occupation associated uh, health outcomes. So we can look at we can look at variables um, for miners in Appalachian coal country to those without, um, compared to the rest of the United States. This is all very kind of clean and dry and quantitative, right? This is epidemiology. This is important statistics. But if I showed you this table, would you really feel much? Would this elicit any kind of like emotional reaction from you? And unless you're a true numbers geek like me, maybe not. And that's not good because a real risk in epidemiology is this thing called numbers or data fatigue. And it's this phenomenon where, like, for example, where I am dealing with epidemiology and research and statistics for over a decade now, um, you start to see so many tables and so many risk factors and statistics and statistically significant this and that. And there's this risk you run of becoming numb to the meaning behind the numbers. So here's where visual epidemiology comes in. Visual epidemiology gives numbers and statistics a pulse, it gives numbers and statistics a heartbeat. And really, why I like this subfield is because it's this really cool marriage of like left brain and right brain thinking, like quantitative, analytical, mixed with artistic, visual, and creative. It's uh, it's both. Okay, you need the statistics and the table, but you need a way of finding meaning and eliciting um, emotion, and it's really both. So it's this really cool, interesting, I think, approach to understanding disease. So back to this idea of the mines as an occupational hazard and as a risk factor for human health outcomes. So this was a study, or this was a project I was involved in early on in my public health career. These are tanzanite mines in Tanzania. Tanzanite is a precious gem, like a ruby or a sapphire or whatever. It's this really kind of cool turquoise-looking gem, and it's only found in one place in the world, in this location in Tanzania. That's why it's called tanzanite. And these are the only mines in the world where, if you dig down deep enough, you'll find tanzanite. And so this is what the mines look like. This is what the local town looks like. These are where a lot of the miners live when they're not working. This is where their families live. This is what life looks like around the tanzanite mines. There's baby Dr. Bales before he was a doctor, talking to some of the miners and learning some of their stories and talking to them about their lives. And why this becomes meaningful is a lot of the research that we're typically used to looks at just numbers and statistics around why these workers are at higher risk for a lot of health outcomes. Um, but when you're able to actually talk to them and put stories and kind of meaning behind these risk factors, it becomes a whole different thing, a whole different kind of set of emotions. So the miners themselves, these are the people who are behind the statistics, right? Every human health statistic, every epidemiological statistic has a person behind it, right? Every death, every sickness, every case of disease, there's a person behind that number, right? And it's very easy in global health research for these miners to just get lost as statistics. But when you actually, dig down and look at their lives, it gives new meaning to a lot of the data that we see. And part of that is understanding the environment and what life in the mines is really like. So we can say, well, mining is a risk factor, but when you're able to actually kind of see it, smell it, hear it, this is what a typical tanzanite mine looks like, and it's basically just a vertical hole, hundreds of meters straight down, often on very, I would say, sketchy equipment. You can see the kind of wooden ladder leading these people down, and I actually went down to this mine, and the big picture on the right is us at the bottom of the mine. And you can see the sweat kind of pouring off everyone's face. It is incredibly hot down there. Very, very hot, very poor air circulation. All air is pumped in from the surface through a gas diesel generator. So the air that you are breathing smells like gasoline. It's very hot, very, very dusty. It's a dangerous environment. And these workers are down there for 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The product of their labor is they basically dig up these bags of dirt, bring them to the surface, sift them, and look for the product on the right, which is tanzanite. So this mining of tanzanite and other precious materials throughout sub-Saharan Africa has been linked to a number of health outcomes, including risk of HIV and tuberculosis. And we're used to thinking about risk factors as they relate to like one disease. So okay, maybe mining might lead to tuberculosis risk because tuberculosis is a um, respiratory kind of illness. So that kind of makes sense. But why would it also be associated with HIV? And when a risk factor is associated with multiple disease epidemics, when multiple disease epidemics play on each other, this is what's called a syndemic. When two or more diseases act synergistically to magnify the burden of the disease. So HIV is bad on its own, tuberculosis is bad on its own, but when you combine them, it's much worse than either two separately. And that's what's called a syndemic. And it's thought that mining contributes to this risk of syndemic. So, just a little bit of descriptive epidemiology behind the TB HIV syndemic in sub Saharan Africa. That high HIV prevalence significantly or is significantly associated with high tuberculosis incidence. So, where you see high HIV incidence and prevalence, you also see high tuberculosis risk. Sub Saharan Africa has been the hardest hit in the world with this syndemic. Case fatality rates of tuberculosis was more than twice as high for people infected with HIV than those without HIV. So, with HIV, you're much more likely to be infected with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is actually the leading cause of death for people living with HIV in these regions. People living with HIV are 20 to 30 times more likely to develop tuberculosis than those without HIV. So this is the syndemic, okay? That you can see that these two diseases really play off of each other and magnify the risk much more than the diseases separately. And again, it's thought that mining is a key contributor to this. So these are the numbers that typically studies put to all of this, okay? This is describing this syndemic. This is tuberculosis, this is HIV, and this is mining. And these are all the numbers that describe this really devastating syndemic. But again, you probably look at this and don't really feel much, okay? Maybe your blood pressure doesn't do much, okay? You look at this and you say, well, I can kind of interpret what some of these statistics mean. Like I know what an odds ratio is and a relative risk and a p value and stuff like that, but this doesn't really make me feel that much. So we need to go beyond the numbers, and that's what visual epidemiology does. Because this problem, this syndemic, these minors, this might seem like a very foreign problem to you. Okay, this is very much outside the regular day-to-day life experience that a lot of us have over here. So it's very hard for us to feel connected to these issues and these problems. Visual epidemiology, one of the goals is to connect people in different parts of the world. It's to get us in California to feel connected to these miners uh, on the other side of the world by finding common experiences, and it does so through telling stories and through visualizing their experiences, because that's the best way for us to feel something and feel um, empathy and to have emotion behind these statistics is if we can connect on some level with the people behind these statistics. So, how do you relate your own experiences, your life, to these miners, either in the United States, miners in maybe West Virginia, or miners in sub Saharan Africa? How do you create a connection between you and them? That's the challenge of visual epidemiology. So, I'm not going to show this right now, but I put this up on the background material section. Play this video and you'll get a sense of what visual epidemiology brings to the table. And after watching that film, hopefully you watched it, pause this video, and now feel a little bit different about this connection, right? So, how did they form this connection? How did this visual epidemiology video bridge this gap between you and these, different groups of people. And I would say they found connections in kind of everyday experiences that we share. So the case study of tuberculosis and mining in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, is a good one for demonstrating the ability of visual epidemiology. But this works for any disease that we deal with. So this next video I also put up on the website. This is a spoken word poem, which is a form of visual art that goes with visual epidemiology. So again, visual epidemiology is any kind of artistic expression that puts meaning to numbers, whether it is a painting or a documentary or a spoken word poem or a song or a dance, any kind of visual medium that allows you to feel connected to the data. So epidemiology is all about grounding numbers produced from public health research. Okay, the whole MO, the whole name of the game is counting things so that we can describe patterns. Like some neighborhoods have higher risk of diabetes than others. But again, with this approach, we become possibly numb to what these numbers actually represent, which is people. We look at diabetes statistics, for example, all day long, but sometimes we forget that behind all these numbers is a person with their own life and their own story and their own uh, fears, joys, family, etc. And this can get lost when we're just looking at seas of numbers. Okay, again, here's where visual epidemiology comes in to remind us of that humanity. Because data represent people, the individual lives are embedded in the statistics that we study so closely. The goal of visual epidemiology, then, therefore, is to return the humanity from which data were derived through the use of visual media and filmmaking. And this represents a, quote, mixed methods approach. Mixed methods approaches are study designs where we take, for example, traditional quantitative methods like cross-sectional surveys and combine them with other forms of research methodology like qualitative studies or visual epidemiology projects. Whoops. So quantitative epidemiology is, again, putting numbers to things, and it helps us answer the what, where, when, and who. Okay. Visual epidemiology examines the why and the how. It gives meaning to these descriptive patterns. The study and analysis of patterns, causes, and effects of disease conditions through the use of imagery, graphics, photography, art, and impressions. This is visual epidemiology. And visual epidemiology emerged in response to this problem, that there is a general lack of personal connection between individuals on camera and the watching audience. When we portray the life of the individual as a whole, not solely the disease by which they are affected, we risk becoming disconnected. So I like this. I like this quote from this visual epidemiology organization. They said, "We surface issues of health, human rights, and legal complexities in the form of life, love, and human relationships. In doing so, our projects create bonding across cultures and paint a portrait of common humanity." And this is visual epidemiology. Just a kind of quick example of another form of common artistic medium that can be used in visual epidemiology is the use of photography. Okay. This photo represents a visual epidemiology portrayal of a health problem, and that is social determinants of health in urban environments in the United States that typically tend to have elevated rates of total mortality, infant mortality, and violent crime. So in Philadelphia, this is an urbanized environment with high population density. Um, And the statistics tell us that there are elevated rates of a lot of diseases, infant mortality, and etc. Okay. Visual epidemiology helps us generate new ways of thinking about the why and how these neighborhoods produce varying health outcomes. Because we can look at statistics like infant mortality on a map and maybe see that a neighborhood like this is at higher risk of infant mortality. And maybe that shows up as like a hotspot or a pattern on a map. But visual epidemiology helps us to kind of probe the meaning behind that. How do the community residents perceive the relationship between place and health? And if you look at this photo and try to unpack the imagery behind here, um, what does this say to you? I think the first thing that I see when I look at this photo is these kind of bars that to me kind of represent this almost prison aesthetic. I see the American flag on the other side of the bars. Like maybe we're separated from the American dream and it's just out of our reach. I also see a community garden in the distance, maybe representing hope and the fight against disease. And then I also see in the far background the project development houses that are typical in these neighborhoods. So if you sit with this image, you can really kind of start to unpack the meaning behind it. And that's the point of visual epidemiology, okay? To portray meaning that this photograph is meant to represent a lot of the statistics that we see, the social determinants of health. So, just a quick note, just because it's a photograph does not necessarily make it a visual epidemiology um, project. Okay. So, to me, taking a photo of a McDonald's restaurant to represent the obesity health crisis in the United States does not elicit any meaning or feeling for me. It's just a picture of a McDonald's. Okay. So again, just because it's a visual medium doesn't necessarily make it a visual epidemiology project. The goals need to match those of the goals of visual epidemiology that we talked about earlier in this lecture, making connection, bridging gaps, and putting meaning and feeling behind the statistics and the numbers. And not all visual epidemiology has to be depressing. Remember, the goal is to make people feel something beyond just looking at numbers. And that can be laughter or any other kind of human emotion. Visual epidemiology makes use of the statistics that describe epidemiological patterns, but the focus is giving the numbers a meaning. And this is an important point to be had, and why that picture of McDonald's is not necessarily a visual epidemiology project. So I want to show you guys an example of a previous class project because of the COVID, I'll call it situation. We're not able to actually do this lab in class, so I'll be integrating it into the final exam makeup. But this is just an example of what a student in one of my epidemiology classes came up with for her visual epidemiology project. And typically, I hold an award show, the Jon Snow Award for Excellence in Visual Epidemiology. And she was the winner that semester. Um, Her project revolved around the health health problems associated with professional dancers, specifically body image dysmorphia amongst dancers. And so she found some statistics that showed that this group is at higher risk of having body image disorders, and then this leads to a whole range of other public health problems. And she produced this visual epidemiology project combining original dance choreography, spoken word poetry, and documentary filmmaking. And just as an FYI, she created and produced this film in 3 days. So I threw this up in the background section. This gives you an idea of kind of a really good example of what visual epidemiology is, okay? Because it goes from this, looking at statistics that show that dancers are at increased risk for body image dysmorphia, to after watching this film, hopefully you feel something different. And that's the whole point. Okay, so this has been visual epidemiology. This is meant to be in a quick introduction, an FYI, if you will, that hey, this is a thing. This is a cool thing. this is a new thing. And if you're interested in this kind of methodology, I would encourage you to explore it further and to incorporate it into future research projects. This has been Dr. Bales on Pandemic Radio. Over and out.